Thank you. So good morning, everyone. So my name is Rudy Palmieri. I am a senior lecturer in strategic communication at the University of Liverpool. And today I have the pleasure to chair this panel on cultivating reasonable persuasion in a fractured world. So in the next hour, we would like to address a topic that is at the heart of the purpose of the Oxford Convergence. How can people, communities, organizations engage in open, trust-based, respectful, and reasoned dialogue on questions of political, societal, and cultural relevance? This question is of particular urgency at the moment. We are living in a world marked by violence, polarization of opinions, and mutual distrust. Phenomena like misinformation, hate speech in social media, the resurgence of populistic and extremistic rhetoric reveal how difficult it is to engage in respectful and mutually beneficial dialogue. This difficulty in dialogue does not only apply to global economic political affairs, but also to our daily life within our communities, families, and workplaces. When I talk to organizations or I offer them training on communication, I constantly observe how difficult it is for coworkers, even those colleagues who share friendship, to trust each other and communicate transparently and effectively. There is sometimes the impression that being honest, kind, and collaborative is incompatible with being effective, efficient, smart, and successful. Taking together all these problems tempt us into a position of delusion and skepticism towards the value and usefulness of communication and persuasion in building a peaceful, united, and prosperous society. We may easily lose hope in the possibility of constructive dialogue and choose to avoid communication, like the sailors in the Odysseus episode, which I will return to at the end of this panel. Or even worse, become cynic manipulators who know how to deceive other people into following our ideas, like the sirens. I remember when I finished high school many years ago, I told my chemistry teacher that I was going to study communication. And he was very disappointed, saying to me, "You are going to learn how to mislead and deceive people." So this panel instead is founded on the belief that even though persuasion has a dark side, it primarily fulfills an intrinsically positive function in human life. This was clear to earlier scholars in classical rhetoric, like Aristotle, who felt the urgency to distinguish reasonable forms of persuasive communication from manipulative ones. But as Ratzinger underlined in the Spe Salvi, when he was comparing scientific and moral progress, I quote, "In the field of ethical awareness and moral decision-making, there is no similar possibility of accumulation for the simple reason that man's freedom is always new and he must always make his decision anew," end of quote. So we felt it was important to relearn and rediscover this tradition in the concrete context we are confronted with its peculiar challenges and opportunities. Recent phenomena like Charlie Kirk's Prove Me Wrong debates have revamped a reflection on the true nature of persuasion, discussion, and dialogue. Is it enough to freely express one's viewpoint and outline logical arguments? When we try to persuade each other, is there a legitimate place for emotions and interests? And above all, how can we educate ourselves and the younger generations to a culture of reasonable discussion? How to encourage such culture to inspire our daily conversations with family, friends, and colleagues? We would like to address these questions today with the help of two experts who, through quite different paths, have come to the topic of persuasion. Penny Roche, she's an English teacher, curriculum lead, and designated safeguarding lead at Landmark International School in Cambridge, where critical thinking, research, and ethical engagement with knowledge are central to the curriculum. And Andrea Rocci is full professor of linguistics and argumentations at Università della Svizzera Italiana, Lugano. His teaching and research activity focuses on argumentation and rhetoric and how, in different communication contexts, arguments can support sound decision-making processes. And I'll start with Andrea. In your research, you have deeply reflected on the compatibility between persuasion and reasonableness. So to begin with, I'd like to ask you a basic but not trivial question. It's actually 3 questions in one. What is persuasion? Is it a good or a bad thing after all? And what's the relationship between persuasion and reason?
So thank you for having me here. Pretty emotional to be here. It's the place and the occasion that makes me very emotional. But anyway, when I start a course on argumentation, I teach argumentation mostly to communication students. And I usually start with this question: is it desirable to be able to persuade other people? To the extent to which students answer, because not all students like to answer teachers' questions, to the extent to which they answer, they say yes, of course, they're communication students. They're right in saying yes. But then I ask, is it desirable to be persuaded? Then they start having big doubts about that. So some just say, no, it's not desirable to be persuaded. So we get in this situation that persuasion is seen as a desirable dark art, a weapon. If you look at a handful of popular science or self-help books about persuasion, they're all about persuading others to do what we want and not being persuaded. Self-defense against persuasion, but also attack. Book titles speak of dark psychology, mind manipulation, forbidden knowledge, programming other people's mind. And the book covers have pictures of puppeteers with brains, and even brains in a jar, guns, and other not so subtle metaphors of power and control that populate this frankly wretched literature. Lobbyists, spin doctors, advertisers are seen a little bit like modern sorcerers wielding a weapon, something that basically hurts people and society in order to pursue selfish ends. Even when it's done with a good cause, it always contains an element of violence, as it overcomes people's freedom and self-determination. So we all have lived at least once in our experience interacting with others, someone who tells you in advance, don't even try to persuade me, I've already decided. The lone decision maker. Paradoxically, it seems that younger people are increasingly turning to AI chatbots for help in their deliberations and advice on how to interact with others. I don't have hard evidence, but when I a few weeks ago, when I did the story of the lone decision maker with first-year students in my course on discourse analysis, then I said, well, maybe your friend before that asked ChatGPT and general laugher. So that's not evidence, but it's suggestive in a way. So, but in reality, if by persuasion we mean assenting to a judgment because of what someone else has communicated to us, thanks to our interactions with other human beings, it's strictly necessary for social life. People need persuasion in order to work and to live in an increasingly complex world. Could be based purely on trust, as when my wife tells me to pick up the umbrella because it's raining, and I do. Or it could require that some reason, an argument is given in support of the proposition for which assent is requested. The latter, argumentation, has been for a long time the object of my academic research and teaching. However, I observe that argumentation, practice of reason giving, is pervasive of a variety of contexts. I would like to briefly speak about 2 contexts I've had the occasion to observe closely. Journalists. In a project, I observed journalists who routinely discuss in newsroom meetings about which stories are newsworthy and worth publishing, evaluate past decisions and practices. Clearly, individual journalists and desks have their stories to pitch, and they win when their stories are chosen. Yet everyone is committed to the success of the paper or the newscast, and they want to publish the stories that people read or watch. So winning is not the whole story. That was very clear. And the editor-in-chief, the producer of the newscast, sometime or maybe often, may not have a claim, any standpoint to defend. They are just there wanting to be persuaded by the best reasons to make the best decision. This is what we observed. Sometimes when I talk about these scenarios, the reaction is, oh yes, but this is not persuasion. This is decision-making. Ah, good, maybe dissociating the two is part of the problem. So towards the exterior, always persuasion, toward the interior is decision-making. That will open up a whole story about corporate communication, but I'll cut on that, because I want also to mention another context that I observed, finance. I spend a lot of time, like Rudy, looking at financial communication. Every quarter, managers of company listed in the stock exchange present their results and submit themselves to the judgment of investors, securities analysts that work for professional investors. Typically, managers discuss the results in online conference calls with long Q&A sessions that are meticulously prepared, because the numbers typically don't tell the whole story, don't speak for themselves. One interesting thing is that everyone's preferences are aligned. The preferences of the investors and the preferences of the manager are aligned. They're all of the profit party. There's nobody of the loss party. So it's not that there's the right and the left, and you have someone who is hostile by definition to the managers. So investors are more than willing to be persuaded that the firm is valuable investment if given good enough arguments. Ultimately, predictions are uncertain. It's not a matter of certainty or calculation, but rather of plausibility given the evidence, of credibility of plans and promises. One former student, now a brilliant young human who now works in the financial communications of a Swiss company, once told me something refreshing. You better give good, honest arguments to professional investors, because they are more clever than you. You cannot fool them. At the same time, she stressed how much professional investors value the human face-to-face contact with managers on the occasion of financial roadshows, when companies try to persuade investors. Good arguments are not detached from human interaction, and being persuaded by good arguments is good for you. Yet, as a researcher, I've been confronted often with the realization that a lot of scientific research on persuasion looks worryingly similar to the covers of those self-help books. Robert Cialdini, a psychologist, author of a famous book on persuasion, Influence is the title, defines it very restrictively as those techniques that are meant to produce automatic, mindless compliance from people, a willingness to say yes without thinking first. A lot of purported research on persuasion is what I call basically research on human stupidity. An example that captures this very nicely is economics. Classical and neoclassical economics is based on a theory of rationality, a model of the human decision maker, that's decision making, that is sometimes dubbed the homo economicus. But when something in the markets is not explainable in terms of the combination of the rationality of individual decision makers, we need to introduce another element of irrationality, a theory of unreasonable decision, and there you have all behavioral economics inspired by the works of psychologists such as Daniel Kahneman. In fact, since the early modern era, this degraded conception of persuasion as its counterpart, the solitary reasoner, who then becomes a solitary decision maker. We find this character, the beginning of this character, of the solitary reasoner, in Descartes. Someone who starts from observation of reality and then makes up his mind by himself. We need to understand it is a new character introduced by Descartes, one that changes radically the way we think about reasoning. In the Discourse on Methods, he says that he decided to treat anything vraisemblable, very similar in Italian. It's not easy to translate in English, plausible, likely. as false. So anything vraisemblable, anything very similar is false. But it's important to note that this word vraisemblable translates a key word of ancient dialectic. In Greek, it was eikos. So what we can approve of, because it's, for instance, something that is accepted in our community, something that appears good, and that could be a starting point. Actually, he argues against the utility of debating starting from establishes and therefore vraisemblable opinion passed on by teachers. Disagreement among teachers is a scandal for Descartes that shows not only the falsity of at least one opinion, but also the ill-foundedness of both. Because if they were well-founded, persuasion would be automatic, more geometrical, so like a mathematical proof. Thinking built on tradition, he says, is likely an ugly medieval city with winding alleys and irregularly shaped buildings. Thought built on first principle based on observation is like a Renaissance ideal city with straight avenues, geometric squares, and so on. He wasn't just rejecting scholasticism and the medieval university tradition. He was, in fact, rejecting the thinking tradition, the tradition about reasoning of whole antiquity. He was rejecting dialectic, which is the idea that we primarily reason in dialogue, that reason is for dialogue. Now, it's interesting that criticism of Descartes featured prominently in the work of a guy called Chaim Perelman, a Belgian philosopher, who is one of the 2 or 3 thinkers credited with putting argumentation back on the map of scholarly research in the mid-20th century. For Perelman, the long-term consequence of the abandonment of dialectic, the primacy of the solitary reasoning and demonstrative mathematical proof, was to leave outside 99% of the decisions that matter for life of people in society. Public life was abandoned to propaganda. And for Perelman, a Jewish person writing in the aftermath of World War II, the consequences of this abandonment were all too clear. Perelman's answer to this deficit was striking. He said, let's go back to Aristotle.
Thank you, Andrea. And let's go back to Aristotle then.
Okay.
So what is so interesting in Aristotle's view on persuasion and rhetoric and its connection to reasoning that we should still go back to it?
So 3 things, many things are super interesting in Aristotle, but I decided to talk about 3. The first is I've already introduced, is the anchoring of rhetoric to dialectic. The second is Aristotle's optimism about persuasion. And the third is the centrality of argument and inference. They're all related. So first of all, it's striking that Aristotle decided to write a book on rhetoric. Plato and Socrates, that we know mainly through Plato, had a negative view of the art of persuasion, sophistry. The sophists are often the polemical target, depicted as masters of an art without a clear object of study. He says, oh, you're not even psychologists, you are psychopomps, so people who just manipulate the mind. So vulgar manipulators. So Aristotle breaks with that, and in his book on rhetoric says, from the outset, that's the first sentence of the book, that rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. So dialectic reasoning in dialogue, and rhetoric is analogous to dialectic. So this had enormous consequences. This, the ancients and medieval subscribed to this connection, and basically that led to the first nucleo, or what was called then the trivium. So the humanities curriculum of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. It was made of grammar, dialectic, which was largely logic taught in dialogue, and rhetoric that went on for centuries. Or since we are in England, I would like to mention one remarkable Englishman, a person of the 12th century, John of Salisbury, who who was the secretary of Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, John wrote a treatise entitled the Metalogicon, which reads as a defense of the unity of logic and rhetoric. Echoing Cicero, he talks about the sweet and fruitful union of reason and the word, illa dulcis et fructuosa coniugatio rationis et verbi, as the foundation of civilization, reason and the word, and the foundation of human friendship. He defends this union both against those who view rhetoric as purely literary endeavor guided solely by practices, and those logicians who are interested only in abstract problems. So that's the first thing, anchoring persuasion into dialectic. Second thing, in anchoring persuasion to reason, Aristotle founds this possibility on a basic fundamental optimism on human nature. He defends rhetoric in the first pages of the book, saying, I quote, "Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites, so that if the decisions are not what they ought to be, the defeat must be due to the speakers. Things that are true and things that are better are by their nature practically always easier to prove and more persuasive." So I find this quote absolutely amazing, because basically Aristotle says it's on us. This is a position that rejects both the naive position that the naked truth will affirm by itself, like in Descartes, that say, okay, if they had good reasons, they would persuade the other party, unaided, but also the pessimistic idea that people will be always easy to manipulate. Personally, I like to contrast this with Machiavelli's chapter 18 of The Prince, where he says that the prince needs to seem honest and good, but not necessarily be according to this quality in fact. Because, he says, the vulgar, il vulgo, are always taken by what a thing seems to be and by what comes of it. And in the world, there are only the vulgar. Nel mondo non v'è che vulgo. So there are not, everyone is easy to manipulate. Well, my teacher, from which I've learned the little I know about argumentation at Dorigotti, says that this Aristotelian optimism is the most realistic foundation for democracy. On the other hand, if Machiavelli is right and in the world there's only the vulgar, we are done. But I do not think we are done. I do think there are princes today that are putting to the test the words of Machiavelli in their alternative facts, and it turns out they are not true. The reaction is there, especially when local, real community of proximity are involved. The reaction is clearly there, I think. The true, the just, the beautiful will not impose by themselves without the cooperation of our reason, which is capable of grasping them, and without attention to the reason of the other. And that's the third point. This attention to the reasoning of the other is exercised in relation to the concrete circumstances in which we encounter them. And the third point is basically, well, it's a little more technical, so I will try to cut to the bone and keep the jargon to a minimum. Aristotle places argument as the core of persuasion and presents argument as an inferential device, similar to deduction, a kind of syllogism, he says, but with special features. And now I know that when I mention the word syllogism, 99% of people of this century have strong feelings of revulsion because it seems, oh, syllogisms, it's rigid, it's inauthentic, it's useless. Oh, reasoning in syllogisms, duh. That's more or less the reaction I get. By the way, medievals loved that. They loved syllogisms. But let us come to the most important point. An argument for Aristotle needs to be understood as a proposal to the addressee to follow an inferential path, leading to us and to the proposition that constitutes the thesis, making it follow from reasons that the other already accepts. So many of these reasons are also left unsaid. Imagine that we are discussing whether a talk in defense of persuasion or a talk about the importance of AI was any good. One could say, did the speaker give any concrete example? And let us suppose that the answer is clearly no. This rhetorical question operates like an argument in your mind, activating tacit shared premises that someone ought to have examples to prove that something is important. There should be at least an example. These are premises in our cultural common ground and personal experience about the need of concrete examples, but as means of knowing and of teaching about persuasion, about AI, or about any other topic. Each of you has built an inference in their mind, and it is the strength of the argument that produces assent. Once argumentation has been made accessible as an inferential path, it works on its own. The medievals made a comparison between the longbow, you know, the English longbow, and the English longbow needs a strong man, a man that is strong and well trained to throw with force the arrow. And they say that is ethical persuasion. So when I'm persuaded by the person. However, they said, well, argument is like a crossbow. If you have a crossbow, once you have activated the mechanism, it goes by itself. So even if you are a dwarf or a little Italian with the crossbow, not the strong Englishman with the longbow, you can shoot. And because it works by itself, so it somehow reasons becomes the other's possession. They detach themselves from the communicative context with it they are initially shared, from the act of arguing, and from the person who argues. They begin, so to speak, another life, interacting with the wealth of experience of the one who receives them. So, if argument is an invitation to inference, then one has to take care of both parts, both the inference and the invitation. It's unreasonable not to take care of the invitation part. First, you need to start from what your audience thinks, what they care about, and what they recognize as true. There is no escape from that. No matter how much you throw pieces of reasoning at people, it will not do any good until it becomes their reasoning. Now, it's one interesting quote from two American authors, Aiken and Tallis, who wrote recently a book on political argument in a polarized world. They say that we don't have too much argument. We have too little argument because we substituted argument with a pretense of argument, where I throw pieces of reasoning in the face of other people, but don't take care of their reasoning. Because the reasoning that matters in an argument is not my reasoning, but the reasoning of the person I am addressed. But sorry, I talked too much, I think.
Thank you. Penny, in teaching language and literature, you try to help students become creative and critical thinkers within a fragmented, multi-voiced information landscape. So we have heard from Andrea what reasonable persuasion means, but how do we educate students so that they can participate in debate and dialogue towards reasonable persuasion? Only easy questions from me today.
Only easy questions. All right, thanks so much, Rudy, and thank you for having me here. So this is, I'm going to talk about this in just a moment in terms of an example of a lesson that we do with our students. But I want to start off, Andrea's been describing the historical and theoretical kind of history of rhetoric and argumentation and persuasion. And I'm at the other end. I'm at the reception end up to the 16-year-old end. And so my job is really to think about educating students. And it is increasingly important in a world where democracy is being threatened and where students are being, or children, young people, are being positioned to respond to ideas that they're not sure how to combat. They're surrounded by disinformation, they're surrounded by propaganda, and they are having to try to make decisions about what they believe and what they think. So the first thing that I would say is it's absolutely fundamental that we educate students and young people in how to form their own opinions first right? What do they actually think? What do they believe? And then from there, to think about the norms of debate, the norms about how to form clear arguments and how to engage in dialogue, so that they have something to say, they've got something to persuade others of, they know what they think and what they believe, but equally they can listen to what others are saying, and that together then there's a forming of a new understanding and a greater understanding, a collaborative understanding. I asked my year 11s, I said I was going to come and do this panel, and I said, what do you think? What should I say? You know, do you think that there's a place for reasoned persuasion in a fractured world? And one of them said, well, if we don't have reasoned persuasion, how are we ever going to move away from having a fractured world? So I thought that that was really great, and thank you very much for that tip from my year 11s. Okay, so my premise is that we need to absolutely teach students how to think, how to research, how to form opinions in a safe space before they get out into a space which is perhaps a little bit more fractured and argumentative, and equally how to listen to each other. So that's the art of critical thinking. So at the heart of everything that I would do in school, and I know I've had a few conversations with some of you, I know there are English teachers in the room here at the moment who absolutely would stand by that idea that critical thinking is absolutely key in terms of how we approach the information that's coming at us. And in the world that we're living in, which is why I do this lesson, it's coming at us in sort of vastly more ways than we've had to cope with before. So let's start with really young ones. I teach from year 11-year-olds to 16-year-olds, but I'm also responsible from reception. So we're through school. So as a really general rule, very young students, those of you with children will know they want to talk over each other, right? So, you know, something happens in the playground and everyone's talking about, no, this happened, no, absolutely, this happened, this happened, this happened. They haven't yet learned that there's, from Faith and Reason, the concept of a plurality of positions. And they think that theirs is the only truth, right? So the concept that this young fellow, you know, bumped into me and was being malicious and he hates me and my life is about to come to an end. The concept that that person tripped over and by mistake, you know, I can't take that on board. What are you talking about? He absolutely hates me. So those conversations, right, trying to help students to see that there are different ideas, different positions is really important, right? And if we don't help them to think about that, then we risk that we think that we're the only arbiters of any truth in the world. And we're not able to accept that there might be other positions that we can take on board to form our understanding of the world. Okay, so to this idea, we have an education, or we propose an education where trying to frame an argument, thinking about how to listen to others is fundamental for our journey as humans. One of the things we have in school is debate. Many of you may well have been in debate club. And that idea of having premises where you have to win at all costs, I think is not a useful model. There are some elements which are useful in terms of framing a debate and an argument, but actually they're useful skills, but doesn't go far enough. The point in educating about persuasion and debate is not so that we can win, but so that we can grow in understanding. That concept may be that we can let truth emerge, which I think is an Aristotelian concept. So I come back to this idea of students being able to form their own opinions, which may seem radical, right? We're coming out of 14 years or so in the UK of education, which a lot of which was about rote learning and about saying, if you repeat what I tell you, this knowledge, then you'll pass your exam, you'll get to university, you'll get a great job, and your life will be brilliant, right? What that provides is children who know what the right answer is, so-called right answer, but not children who can think for themselves and who have any idea about how to form their opinion, and not even any idea about what their own opinions are, because nobody's ever asked them. The Oracle at Delphi, and I love this because I love classics, but also because it's right at the beginning of Faith and Reason, has the admonition, know thyself, right? So who are you? What do you believe in? And have you got something that you want to persuade others of, right? And are you ready to sit and listen to others persuading you of something, that might be true? And together, can you come to a new understanding that might help us to make this world a better place? So that's really important. Creating a safe space where students can begin to think, what do I believe? And to play around with that a little bit. Models that treat persuasion solely as a dominance exercise, I think, are really problematic. As a discovery exercise, as a curiosity exercise, lead to an enhanced understanding of ourselves and the world around us. So how do we do that?
I'm sure that many of you have had the opportunity to ask that person what their opinion is of something. What do you think about this? And you got either or
Right. It seems to be my because it's frightening to give your opinion, right? I was listening to an educationalist who was saying that she went into a school and asked students their opinion, and they all looked blankly, and after a slight pause said, "Can you tell me what the right answer is, please, miss?" And she was horrified, went out, and the teacher said, "I'm really sorry about that. The thing is, here we teach for the 12 plus and the 13 plus exams. They have to learn what the right answers are, and that gets them into elite schools, and then they have opportunities to be, to the world that, that kind of pathway." So getting students to be brave enough to express their opinions is about creating a safe space for them. Interestingly, I mean, yesterday we had Sir Anthony Seldon, asking us to take time and breathe. I think that one of the things that is missing often in education is the time to think, to create actually a space of silence where students can actually think, right? So we often say we have this, I don't know if any of you remember think, pair, share, right? So you're going to think about this idea, and then you're going to pair up with somebody, you're going to talk to them, and then you're going to share to the whole group. And we go to the pair, we give them like 30 seconds, and we go, right now, let's pair, right? And then students, I've got nothing to say. I don't know, what do you want me to share, right? So that space for creating space for thinking is really important. I equally think that space for an essay, for example, from the verb essayer, to try out an idea, right? The French essayist de Montaigne talks about, he would often think, not even be 100% sure where he was going from when he started the essay to what his conclusion would be at the end, because the process of writing was the process that helped him to formulate and understand his ideas. So there has to be space for that within the classroom. And we start that from really young, right? By the time they get to year 11, they should be well versed in how to formulate an opinion, how to think about how to speak with clarity about their ideas. Okay, where am I next? I'm thinking I would like to actually just really briefly show you an example of a lesson that we might do to kind of help with this. This is for perhaps our year 10s or our year 11s. A lot of the work that we've been doing is around the fact that AI is an issue, as we've all been talking about. It's here, it exists, so we have to teach our students how to navigate it. I think it is useful in terms of a partnership, but it requires training in how to use it because it's just a tool, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So this is an example of something that we might show to our students. I think there we go. So we've been thinking about this idea that a brief history of communication. So we might sort of say, when you were thinking about the navigation landscape, and we talk about the fact that we start off with cave paintings all the way through, but this is not exhausted list, by the way. This is what could fit on here. And also for transparency, because I think transparency is really important. I say this to my students, Claude helped me to produce this. So I did have to go in and change some of Claude's suppositions about thoughts. So the point here is that access to information, we've always had access to information, right? But we need to think about how we make informed decisions, right? And about how we know about ourselves and the world around us. So this is some of the critical thinking questions that we might show to our students. We might think about, okay, so there were cave paintings, but who was in the cave? Who was telling that story? There's a small group of those who are present. Oral traditions, again, think about who holds the memory, who are telling those stories. So you're always thinking critically about where your information comes from. The word spreads, we have writing, right? So then I can write down my thoughts, and somebody who isn't with me even can read and think about what I'm saying. Printing press comes along, fantastic, but who can afford to print? Who can afford to buy books? We start thinking about the ability, as 1870, the Education Act here in the UK, people can begin to actually read for themselves. So they're choosing where they can go, but how can they read? Who is being allowed to have that opportunity to read? Then public libraries, right? That is a big, huge change in access to information, for freedom of information. Obviously, this is US and UK centric, but it's universal in principle. But actually and that's a point for today, right? Libraries are closing all around us. So free access to books, to actually sit down and read a book, is becoming less and less available, although we think it's available on the internet. But then you have to have internet, and you have to have access to a computer. So we talk about the great equality, but COVID showed us that that great equality was not true. There are a whole load of kids who didn't have access to computers and didn't have access to the internet in this country, let alone in the rest of the world. And then we talk about this curated, searched, and now synthesized. Interestingly, Claude here, these are all my thoughts, and I put in, Claude put here infinite knowledge. And I took it out because what we get on AI is not infinite knowledge, right? There are whole tracts of the community who are not represented on the internet, and therefore whose information is largely oral communities who are not represented there, different minorities who are not represented, so it isn't infinite knowledge. So then at the end, we say, who is choosing what knowledge to share? When we were doing this with children, we actually asked Gemini, who is choosing the knowledge, AI knowledge to share? It's quite a long answer, so I haven't got it here, but it is quite interesting, right? You could ask Gemini yourself, and there are layers and layers and layers of people who are deciding what goes on to these large language models in terms of search. So then we talk about how are we accessing information? How do we center our own agency as human beings interacting with a tool? And we think about critical thinking. So that's what we're doing. Some of those things are about teaching them how to think and not what to think, because that's where a propagandist can take hold. If you have students who are conditioned to just accept passively information that is given to them, rather than knowing how to think and to assess the information that is coming at us, then that is when democracy becomes at risk. So we have to start from when the students are young and teach them, and that can feel tricky. Those of us who are teachers in the room, that can feel like a little bit tricky, having kids in front of you who might actually tell you their opinion, right? But it's sitting with that and having the courage to sit with that. So these are just some of the things that we do in order to think critically, particularly at the moment with AI. That is a really big thing that we're talking about. I feel like I went slightly off topic there, but there you go. We'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Beppe.
Thank you, Penny. And you also work as a safeguarding lead.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a question about safety, because somehow persuasion and safety could be seen as conflicting and incompatible. To engage in persuasion bears the risk of offending, for example. Yeah. And we don't want persuasive communication to cause pain in the interlocutor, even though at a certain level of pain is required in order to grow and learn. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent is safety required to facilitate dialogue and to create the groundwork for persuasion?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I think there's two types of pain here. There is the pain, as you said, that is required for growth. And then as safeguarding lead, there's the pain that we want to try and protect themselves actually from, so keeping students safe. So the first thing I think is the pain that's required for growth. In order to enter into dialogue at the education stage, safety is really important. The space to be able to make mistakes is really important. To say something that maybe everybody else thinks, oh my gosh, what? But to create a space in which those conversations can happen. It's paradoxically a space where all views are welcome is not necessarily a comfortable space. So it is up to the teacher to hold that space, which requires training. And it also requires the teacher to know thyself. I think that it's quite easy to get triggered sometimes in a situation when you are not aware of your own thoughts, values, beliefs. So that's the first thing in terms of creating that safe space. And it's about a curiosity agenda, not a dominance agenda. I have got a student who we run philosophy classes, and he came in with some really extreme views, but he was able to express those views within that group. And then the empathy from the other students and the curiosity and the thinking has led him to reposition himself. And he's come towards a sort of a more moderate perspective in terms of how he's, but that was a journey, because if you can't say things, then how can anybody, how are you going to get anywhere else if you're always shutting people down? So I would say, as a safeguarding lead, if somebody says something to me that I think, for example, right, I have students who come up to me and say, I think Andrew Tate is fantastic, and I am, really pro everything that he says. So, and I have teachers who come to me and they're really scared and worried about, what do I say when somebody speaks to me like that? And I say, approach it with curiosity, right? We say that all behavior is communication. If a student is standing in front of you and is saying, I think what Andrew Tate says is really fantastic, why does that student feel that that is something that resonates with them? Where are they coming from? Ask, okay? So be curious, have a conversation, and then understand a little bit more about what that student is thinking. And then you can build understanding together. I think that, as Aristotle perhaps says, that idea that they'll say,
yeah,
I think.
Not Aristotle.
Yeah, I know you're. No, he's not Aristotle. However, he knows a lot about Aristotle. Just for clarity, that truth tends to be more persuasive than the opposite, right? And so it's not me that's necessarily persuading, but the things that perhaps in me that are truth or truthful are recognized by that which is in the other person. So it's that connection. Again, everything is about connection and about that humanity. I've heard students learning how to speak respectfully with each other. I had a debate that we had where one student was saying, look, quite frankly, that tone that you're using with me, I cannot handle it. I can't hear you. I can't, you're speaking with me really disrespectfully. And the other student, these are year 8s, the other student said, no, absolutely, I understand what you're saying. I think it's because I've just told you the same thing 3 times and I'm beginning to feel quite frustrated about the fact that you don't understand me. But the other student said, okay. And so there was a kind of a meeting rather than a pulling apart, because we've been trying to teach them how to approach that sort of understanding. They had this ability to talk to each other. Okay. So that's from a time space of kind of learning how to think. But from a safeguarding perspective, in a world where disinformation is a significant threat to democracy, we need to think about how students approach and use information. And as AI grows, we have to educate them in terms of how to access information. And what we're thinking and critical thinking is key here, and so is agency. The propagandist wants us all and our students to accept evidence that has been pre-weighed and for us to accept it without question. It's a loyalty test, right? And it's a dominance agenda. The person who comes to us with a curious agenda and is suggesting ideas and is ready to listen to us and where we can meet together, that is somebody who is interested in my agency and is interested in their own agency, and that is a communication and a connection together. That learning is not about dominance, that's about curiosity. And it's not about hijacking the space. So what I would say in terms of, I know we have, how are we doing for time? Are we okay?
They are cut. No, he's not on get there.
I'm wondering just because
we persuaded him to leave the room.
Mainly because he's left. I know we started a bit late. Okay.